Hi, everybody. Thank you all so much for coming out on a cold February night. I was going to say February night. My name is Kate Kopp. I am the editor of the Maine Monitor. For those of you who don't know us, we are a nonprofit, nonpartisan news organization. We are based in Augusta, but we cover stories across the state. We focus primarily on an enterprise and investigative reporting. I'm not going to give a very long spiel here other than to say thank you so much to the Alamo for having us in this beautiful space. Yes. Yeah, it's just a lovely, lovely theater. I'm so grateful to be here. And thank you also to the Ezra James Briggs Family Fund for helping us put on this event. It's really wonderful to do this kind of live journalism where we can actually talk to everybody about all of the wonderful reporting that Emmett has done. So with that, thank you very much. Emmett, all yours.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone. It's great to see so many faces of people I've exchanged emails with over the past year or so. My name is Emmett Gartner. I'm the environmental reporter for the Maine Monitor. Been here for a year and a half and covering dams specifically for the past, like I said, year. That reporting most recently encompassed a 4-part series on Maine dams that was published last November. It spanned from hydropower dams and their position in Maine's renewable energy portfolio to the state of Maine's dam safety program and how dams are overseen by the state and monitored for their condition and safety, as well as removal debates and issues with fish passage at other dams across Maine. Tonight, I am joined by a panel of 3 esteemed guests to help me dive into some of those specific aspects of my reporting. Furthest to the right is Susan Lessard, Bucksport's town manager and also chair of the Maine Board of Environmental Protection. This is a board that oversees the Department of Environmental Protection. And then we have Gina Bushong, Orland Board of Selectmen member and one of the local officials spearheading the 4-town committee that is considering municipal dam ownership of 2 of the dams, Toddy Pond, Alamoosook Lake. And then lastly, right to my right here is James Woidt, hydrologist and water resources engineer for Streamworks and lead author of the dams chapter of the 2024 report card on Maine's infrastructure by the American Society of Civil Engineers. So we're going to kick things off with a little presentation by James, who's going to give us the ins and outs of the components of dams, as well as some of the key findings from this report card on Maine's infrastructure, specifically Maine's dams. I believe we have a quick PowerPoint presentation that will be put up on the screen now.
As Emmett shared, I'm James Woidt. I was the lead author on the dams chapter for the American Society of Civil Engineers. So it's a professional society. Every 4 years, we put together these report cards in a way similar to your children receiving their letter grades from home. So we can communicate the state of our nations and our state's infrastructure in kind of an easy to understand way. At ASCE, what we really advocate for is trying to get to B. B is the grade that's adequate for current conditions. And A is kind of top of the line, suitable for future conditions, future population growth, everything that we've got coming to us in the future. But it's really B's our target. Overall, Maine was mostly in the C's and D's, and we'll spend a little bit of time talking about the dams. And so I will try and switch back and forth between looking at the exhibit slides behind me and talking through those. So one of the things that's interesting for me as an engineer working with dams is that in contrast to the rest of the infrastructure that's in the report card, bridges, roads, sewers, dams just kind of blend into the landscape. And people don't always realize that it's infrastructure. These are really highly engineered structures in some regards, or structures that were built just well enough long ago that they lasted until now. And now we're trying to engineer them to last for another 100 years. But when we're talking about a dam, there's a lot of different styles. I've kind of got a pretty typical section up there of what we call an earthen dam. Generally, they impound flow, and there's a narrower portion of the dam called the spillway where most of the water goes through. And so sometimes those two terms get mixed up. So The spillway is generally what's conveying the most flow. And then in certain situations, there's some low level outlet works or gates to draw down the reservoir. So if we can go to the next slide, I've got a couple pictures of the different types, and some of these might look more similar to the ones here of interest in town. Okay, yeah, there we go. And so actually the next slide even too, these are some nice engineering graphics for them, but I think the ones that really help are the next set of slides, or if we can go one more. All right. So these are kind of our four main types of dams when we're looking at it as an engineer. Up on the left are earthen embankments. So we're really using earth, and we're building up kind of like a giant sandcastle of a block flow. We're really careful with the materials that go in there, so they don't let too much water go through the dam. And we've got a stable spillway that doesn't erode, normally concrete, something like that. We've got a lot of gravity dams around Maine, and those include both concrete and a lot of the masonry dams that are kind of built in the 17th and 18th century. They stay stable just by the sheer weight of that stone and that concrete pushing them against the earth. And that weight kind of digs them into the ground and prevents the water from pushing them downstream, just the force of weight. So we call them gravity dams. The two bottom ones are more structural. So the shape and the design of them, the actual concrete and the structural components like resist, kind of like trying to brace a wall or a house or something. If you've done any home repairs, that's kind of what they're doing. They're trying to brace the whole structure. So they work great. They're really fragile if those key structural elements go through. They're really dependent on these. The top two have a little bit more resilience just from the hulk, the mass of those structures. If we could move to the next set of exhibits, please. So this is a lot of words, but one of the interesting things about dams is there's a condition, and there's what we in the public talk about. It's good or bad. It's in bad condition. It's in good condition. Dams have this kind of other category, the hazard classification. That's really how we as engineers look at them. And the hazard class has nothing to do with the actual physical condition of the dam, but has everything to do what happens if that dam fails or misoperates. If that dam were to breach from overtopping during a flood, if we had an earthquake that destabilized it, if we had a bunch of wood get stuck on the gates and couldn't operate them, and we had an overflow situation, what's at risk downstream? What's at risk upstream if these dams were to breach? And there's a hierarchy where at the low end, it's easier to go backwards. At the high end, the high hazard dams would kill people if they were to fail. They're really dangerous. We would expect people to die in the event that they breach during a sunny day, earthquake, something like today, or a rainy day flood event. The significant hazards, the key distinction from them is they do not kill people, or we do not expect them to kill people when they breach. There might be significant environmental impacts. It might wash out state roads or bridges. It's kind of that order of magnitude, not quite rising to the loss of life situation. And then the lowest hazard would be the low hazard. So it's not the other categories. It's really how the low hazards get classified, but the low hazards still can cause millions of dollars in damage. If you happen to have a driveway or a local road, those can get washed out and still classified as low hazard. So these can still have pretty impactful impacts to the community immediately downstreams. But how we regulate and how we design these dams changes with that hazard classification. So the higher that hazard classification is, the more stringent the design is, and the higher the standard we set for that dam, irregardless of its size. If we can go to the next slide, this is just a quick table that MEMA compiled a few years back when they were reviewing their dam safety program. There's been at least 9 dam failures in the state of Maine that we know of. I believe almost all of these dams were low hazard, but as I mentioned earlier, we're still talking about millions of dollars of damage for some of these dams when they breach. So I've been able to work in some other states on dams, and one of the common themes that we've sensed is that dam safety is really not an issue until it is. And it normally takes people dying or becoming hurt, that the state really steps in and funds and staffs these programs at the adequate levels to keep people safe. And so we've had some dam failures here. There's certainly worse that have occurred elsewhere, and we've been fortunate that it's been smaller, lower hazard dams. That doesn't mean that we won't have more significant dam failures happening in the future. I think I've got one more slide. I'm good with that. And so at ASCE, every 4 years, we assess these report cards and we compile. Oh, I don't think this is one of mine.
Map, yeah.
Okay, that's one of yours.
Just some reference, yeah.
Yep. So in the state of Maine, we've got about 1,000 dams across the state that we know of, and big asterisk on that we know of. There's no program or agency out there trying to catalog all the dams. That rule was repealed back in 1993, I think, to register your dam. So we know of at least 1,000. About 700 are actually subject to regulation, either at the state level or the federal level. If it's hydropower, it's generally regulated by the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission at the federal level. Everything else typically falls to the state, to MEMA would be the main authority regulating the remainder dams. Of those 700 dams, the average age is 108, which is old. And when we think about bridges, I think everybody in this room would feel a lot less comfortable thinking about driving across a bridge that's an average age of 108 years old. We have dams in the state dating back to before the country was founded, and we aren't really building many new dams. So there's a lot that are, this being an average, 100, 150, 200 years old in service and in operation across the state. About a quarter of those are in the significant or high hazard category, where loss of life or significant environmental or economic damage is expected. The breakdown on their condition is pretty interesting. We've got about half are in the fair or satisfactory category. And those are kind of terms that we use as engineers for okay or okay most of the time. You should really think about what might happen during an earthquake or an extreme flood event. So they're generally okay in that category. The fair, poor, unsatisfactory are the terms that we use for, oh shoot, you really need to look at this today, kind of in that order. So the poor dams are generally ones that are in really poor condition. There's some concerning things that need to be addressed on a short-term basis. The unsatisfactory dams are generally reserved for ones that have immediate threats to their viability and their condition and pose significant risks to the downstream population, whether it's might be seepage, water going through the dam in a way that we didn't design or control that can erode material out. It might be leaning or failing structural members. Those types of things would go into that unsatisfactory condition where generally we're recommending the owner take immediate actions in that condition and often telling them to drain the impoundment at that point for fear of life and property downstream, depending on the situation. So ASCE kind of considers all these points: the condition, the hazard classification, the state of the dam safety program, regulation, what future needs are, resilience, and the overall need for dams, the capacity for dams in Maine when we assign our grades. We have a pretty holistic process that steps through that. We collaborate amongst ourselves as different authors in the state. So roads and dams and drinking water are all being assessed in the same way. We've got a lot of cross reviewers experienced in both ways to make sure we're being fair in assigning the right category to each of these categories. All of that goes up to a national review and gets distributed amongst other professionals and individual disciplines, and making sure that we're kind of consistently scoring this. You know, we're in the same ballpark as New Hampshire, or relatively, that you can read the report, see the condition of the two programs, and come to the same conclusion. So they're really trying to make sure we're consistent amongst ourselves as a state, and each category is consistent across the country with the category that's assigned. That said, Maine's rating was a D+. It's been there since the report card for Maine started in 2008, I believe. So it's been D+ for the last 8 years that I've been writing it, and for the 8 years before that as well. So there's a lot of room for improvement on Maine's dams. We had a couple key recommendations in the report card, and I want to draw a little distinction here. We have a lot of recommendations for the regulation of dams, for MEMA, for the authority overseeing dams. I like to point out these guys are doing a really good job. There's just not enough of them. It's a really difficult job that we have 1.5 full-time staff to monitor all 1,000 dams in the state. So you can imagine that if you're sitting in Augusta and your job that day is to inspect a dam up in the county, you're spending almost your entire workday just in the car just to get to the dam to do the actual job that you were hired for. So there's a tremendous logistical effort just accessing some of these dams across the state that, in response to agency concerns 15, 20 years ago about not having enough staff to inspect the dams, the legislature's solution was to reduce the inspection frequency and reduce the demands for what the Maine Dam Safety Program has to do. The extra challenge is that right now, I am a licensed professional engineer, and I've got certain ethical and legal obligations that go into certifying designs. The Maine Dam Safety Program should be led by a professional engineer, but that position has been empty for over 3 years. The pay is pretty inadequate compared to what a lot of other jobs will pay. It's also a very demanding job. You know, when there is an emergency, you are leaving your family, you are going to remote parts of the state on little to no notice to help owners respond to an emergency. It's a very demanding job. It is tough to find people interested in taking on that responsibility for that pay. So the staff we do have done a great job. They really just need a lot more help. So we provided some recommendations to MEMA to increase funding, to allow additional staffing to help access some of these dams and fulfill their current legislative authorities. We've also recommended filling that dam safety inspector position, finding another professional engineer so there's somebody to collaborate with. 2 minds are always going to be better than one, especially dams have so many unique aspects in terms of water, the soil interactions, the structural aspects. It gets pretty difficult for one person to serve all those different needs for all the different types of dams that we have in the state. Sustainable funding is a big one. So there's a lot of different ways to fund that program at an adequate staffing level, but finding a solution to fund it at those levels is really something that the legislature, we have recommended resolve. Once we get to that point, we're really hopeful that the MEMA has the capabilities to start focusing on compliance, start focusing on enforcement, which they haven't had at the time or resources to do, especially the last few years. Now, I'll interject real quick. One of their big challenges is that they're in the emergency response department. So 4 years ago when COVID hit, they were helping respond to COVID, not dealing with the dams. That's a unique challenge that our dam safety program has that most other states don't. I think Maine's the only one where it's in the emergency management agency, I believe. And then finally increasing the inspection frequencies once they have that adequate staffing. So that was really our recommendations, that MEMA's doing a great job. We just need more MEMA to really help maintain our dams in safe condition and protect our people here in Maine.
And that's a great segue, because as we've seen, MEMA's inadequacies have real world impacts. We're in part joined by local officials who are dealing with the abandonment process of 3 dams on Silver Lake, Toddy Pond, and Alamoosook Lake, which are high hazard and in unsatisfactory condition. One of them, Silver Lake Dam, was last inspected in 2021, and the report there had immediate recommendations for addressing structural deficiencies with the dam. Those findings were never followed up on, and that in part has kind of led us to the even murkier situation that's facing these 5 towns. So Town Manager Lessard and Select Person Bushong, I was wondering if we could kind of just trace things back to when you first heard about Bucksport Mill LLC's intentions to either sell these 3 dams or pursue the abandonment process before that petition was finally filed in July.
The five towns involved, Bucksport, Orland, Surrey, Penobscot, and Blue Hill, were not the first entities to learn of this process. The first entities contacted by Bucksport Mill were lake associations, Toddy Pond and Alamoosook, which when the communities found out seemed quite interesting that the property owner would be offering these mills to entities without the financial or infrastructure ability to care for them. Once we became aware that that process was going on, the five communities and the two lake associations formed a committee that met every 2 weeks to discuss options available and to try and figure out the process that would be followed when Bucksport Mill LLC filed a petition. They first filed one in July that was inadequate and was rejected by the department. Second one was filed in October, which was eventually accepted by the department. But this law that was enacted in 1996 to allow entities to walk away from ownership or responsibility for these dams has never been carried out fully in the state of Maine. It was passed in 96, but the DEP has never processed one of these from beginning to end. So this guinea pig that is this situation, I would like to think isn't what was contemplated when the legislature passed this law. My guess is it was passed to address the 100 of them that are in the backwoods somewhere that held back a logging pond or some very minor thing, not 3 high hazard dams, which one of them which is a public water supply and an industrial water source for Bucksport generation, without which it can't operate in its current configuration, or Alamoosook and Toddy, which are major recreational lakes in not only this region, but in the state, and are substantial portions of the property tax valuations of each of these communities. We've engaged attorneys. We've had the lake associations, and the Toddy Pond Lake Association has started a Save Our Ponds program. It has a Facebook page. It has a GoFundMe page to raise money to assist the towns with the legal fees that we are accumulating, that none of us budgeted for. We couldn't have seen this coming. This wasn't an anticipated event, but I guess without going on for too long, this is a process. We've learned that the law as it's written isn't necessarily on the side of the communities in terms of what is required. We have to date received 0 information from Bucksport Mill, in spite of the fact that all the towns have requested information with which we would need to have in order to consider assuming ownership of these dams. As I've said repeatedly, I can't imagine standing up in front of a public hearing in the town of Bucksport and saying, "Hi, Silver Lake Dam they want to abandon it. I don't know what it's going to cost. I don't know what shape it's in. I don't know when it was what the last inspection really said, but please vote for this." I mean, that it's unreasonable to think that property taxpayers would do that with no information. And so, well, there's been a lot of people who want this solved right now. Just we get and figure it out later. We don't have the luxury of doing that because people have to vote for this, and you can't ask people to vote if they have no information. And so this process and getting information or trying to, or appealing to the DEP to not allow the petition to move forward because they have not acted in good faith in providing information that a new owner would need. So we're spending a lot of time. There's been so many people working on this and volunteers. The lake associations have, if anyone deserves a round of applause, it's these associations who have really been busting their butt to get people notified, to get people engaged, to raise money. They've just been awesome. There have been people who have done studies of what happens if you let the water out. What do these lakes look like if you let the water out? And it's terrifying. I mean, they are high hazard. It's more terrifying because we lose a quarter of Bucksport. Silver Lake has someone dropped a bomb on it tomorrow. But even the idea of a slow release eliminates public water supply, a fire department hydrant system, a sewer system that relies on this public water. You know, these are major components that, and we didn't set these dams up. We didn't build these things. They were the creation of the industry that was here for many years and utilized them in their processes. And now they're gone, and Bucksport Mill LLC, which had an agreement with the entity that was going to build a salmon farm here to pay for water, which was ended in 2023. And I believe that's what triggered desire to relinquish the dams. There's no longer funding stream that they're getting to support it. I've talked too long, I apologize.
No worries at all. It's all very vital information. And just to provide an overview of the statute and where we are in terms of the abandonment process. So there's a 180-day consultation period overseen by DEP where the dam owner can consult with local municipalities or other interested parties who might take over ownership of the dams. That's where we are right now. Once that period is up, it's sort of up to DEP to accept that the consultation, as like Town Manager Lessard said, occurred in good faith. And if they give their stamp of approval, then the dams would go to the review of 3 Maine state agencies. First on that list would be Department of Inland Fisheries and Wildlife. Each of these departments would consider the dams and the relation to the agency's responsibilities and public value. So for IF&W, it would be looking at the dam's relationship to the water it's holding behind and the fisheries habitat that might exist. After that, the Department of Agriculture, Conservation, and Forestry gets a bite at the apple. They review the recreation value of the dam, other habitat considerations. And then lastly is MEMA, the Maine Emergency Management Agency. Each of these agencies gets 60 days to consider. So altogether, I mean, if they use their full allotted time, it would be 180 days. MEMA is looking for safety considerations. If the dams were released, what kind of hazard would remain? MEMA does not own any dams, as we've gone over. They're quite underfunded as is, and in conversations I've had with officials there, they could not imagine taking over ownership of dams with as high hazard and high maintenance needs as these. And after those agencies review, and if they pass up on the dams, then DEP oversees a process in which the dams are released, the water behind the impoundments, and kind of it's categorized as like the least impactful way, whatever that means. As Susan said, whatever is left over is bound to be impactful, even if it's done in the most minimally impactful way, because what's left are mudflats. So that's where the process is now. I was wondering if we could speak a little bit about what the latest efforts from the 4 and 5 town committees are. There is legislation that was introduced at the beginning of the session by Representative Nina Milliken of Blue Hill that would kind of extend this consultation process and require dam owners to provide more information on the status of their dams to DEP. That's currently being considered by the state legislature. And I was wondering if you could also speak about some of the town hall meetings that are happening among the 4 towns and how you all are thinking about that and approaching things moving forward.
Sure. One little addition to the timeline that you laid out, with the first 180 days, a municipality can ask for an extension of additional 180 days. And that's something we already know that we're going to have to request that, because we've got no information from the dam owner, so we couldn't possibly make the decision. So that's already something that we're keying up, that we want that 180-day extension of the municipal consultation period. One of the things to follow up on what Sue said is the 5 towns are committed to working together and not letting this be a divide and conquer kind of situation. We're committed to joint messaging, our attorneys are working together. We really need to be unified in what we're doing. But with that said, we're all thinking down the road. We're not putting our heads in the sand because clearly these people want to get rid of these dams. So we're all thinking, what are the potential outcomes that could happen, and trying to really be proactive and thinking through some of those. We realize that Silver Lake has probably a very different path than Alamoosook and Toddy. As Sue said, Silver Lake is the water supply. It's hooked up with Bucksport generation. It's actually not in the same watershed with the other 2 dams. So, there'll probably be 2 different paths to go down. So we've been working with the 4 towns that are involved in Alamoosook and Toddy Pond. While those dams are in Orland, all of Alamoosook is Orland property. Toddy Dam, however, that lake has 4 different towns involved: Surrey, Penobscot, Blue Hill, and Orland. So and they're in the same watershed. So we have a lot more joint ability to deal with it collectively. And we've been working with our bipartisan state legislatures. Nina Milliken and Steve Bishop have been outstanding in pulling together a bipartisan group of legislators to help us think through what our options might be in the future, and have introduced draft legislation to figure out how to create a watershed district that could manage these 2 dams. And we are charged now, between now and the end of February, with really filling in that legislation of exactly what we're talking about, how it would work, how it would be paid for, who's going to be involved in managing it. The advantage to this kind of option is that it takes the liability of ownership away from the towns and puts it in a quasi-municipal organization. So it seems like an incredibly feasible opportunity that would serve us all well. And we're in the process, because this is such a quick turnaround, trying to get this all put together by the end of February. We've been doing an awful lot of background work, talking about the Save Our Ponds group. Have been doing a gigantic survey of all of the businesses from Ellsworth all the way to Bucksport. What impacts would it have, so people understand not just the property values, but what's it going to do to businesses? Right now, in the preliminary stage, 92 of the businesses that have responded said it would make a significant impact on their business. Some have said they'd have to close within the next few years. So it's not just property owners, and it's not just recreation, but it has significant economic value to our whole region. So we're trying to get this design and figure out how it would function. So we're having a series of what we're calling public input sessions. And we've got a survey up online trying to get public input, because this is something, as Sue said, even though we're doing the legislation, before it's ever put in place, it will require town votes from all 4 of the towns involved in this. So we really want to have citizen input. This isn't where we want to dictate and say, you got to go vote for this. It's like, help us design this, help us think through these options. So we're having 4 different meetings. The first one is actually tomorrow night in Orland at the Alamoosook Lakeside Inn. And then that's followed on Monday by the one in Surrey. And on let's see, Wednesday, it's Blue Hill, and Thursday is in Penobscot. All the meetings start at 6 o'clock. And we really encourage people to come and participate in these meetings. We'll also be recording them and we're not live Zooming it, but we'll have a recording. We'll post the recordings and summaries of the meetings and the input we get from people. We'll use that input along with other things to make sure that we get this done by the end of February so that we can give it to our legislators and get it in committee and hopefully get it voted out and at least gives us an option because we really want to be proactive about this and not just wait till we're at the end of the process and then go, oh, yeah, maybe we'll take them. So we want to think it through. So.
Great. Thank you for that overview. And kind of going on from that potential proposed legislation for like a quasi-municipal entity to take over dams, there's also plans potentially for bills that could create a revolving loan fund that could be drawn on to cover maintenance costs for the most dilapidated high-risk dams in the state. Other bill that could strengthen Maine's dam safety program and address some of the chronic underfunding and understaffing that James highlighted earlier. And that kind of leads us back to MEMA and the dam safety program's current position, because underlying this situation in Hancock County is the condition of these dams and the unknown factor of the maintenance needs that they might require. So James, I was wondering if you could talk about other dam safety programs that have kind of bulked up their authority and their oversight of dams to allow them to kind of compel dam owners to take the recommendations or maintenance requests from state dam safety officials seriously and follow up on them or compel them to do so in any way. I'm wondering if you're familiar with any kinds of laws that kind of outline that for other dam safety programs, or just in general, what enforcement mechanisms were recommended in Maine's infrastructure report card.
Yeah, I think in addition to the American Society of Engineers, there's a special professional society for dam safety. It's called the Association of State Dam Safety Officials. And the people that can comprise that organization are really dam safety officials. They're Colorado Dam Safety, New Hampshire Dam Safety, all these different state entities that are really contributing to that program. They've come up in concert with some of the federal agencies that own and regulate dams, model dam safety guidelines that are really our go-to for recommending what a dam safety program should be. We do work in several states. Kind of the pattern that we've seen is that it really takes a death, emergency, or very significant dam issue to kind of force the issue to come up to the top of the priority list in the state legislatures. But most states have gone through that process. New York, I know, has done one after several dam failures. They got a fairly robust program. Vermont was in that process, and especially after the 2023 flooding that impacted the state, and they had several dam breaches, they've really kind of turbocharged that. But what we see in a lot of states, and the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission is a good reference too. There's different inspection frequencies for the dams depending on their hazard. You're looking for immediate issues that might develop over time. And then there's normally some sort of regular, maybe it's 5 years, maybe it's 10 years, maybe it's 20 years, some sort of cycle where you do a deeper dive on the dam. You're making sure it's got sufficient capacity to convey the design flood. You're confirming its hazard classification. That can change over time as development moves and encroaches into dam inundation zones. So there's kind of these different levels of checks that these different states and agencies have taken on. I think ultimately that's something that ASDSO and ASCE would encourage the state of Maine towards, something that there's some sort of checking process, and whether that's entirely led by the state or whether the state's in more of an administrative role and requiring that of the dam owners themselves, I think is one of the important questions to consider for how Maine's program would operate.
I think Vermont, as an example, is really salient right now because with the July 2023 flooding, as James mentioned, I mean, there are 50 plus dams that were damaged or overtopped by water. 5 dams failed. The Wrightsville Reservoir, which is a state-owned dam right outside of Montpelier, was within 1 foot of overtopping. Montpelier already had significant flooding from that event, and they were just 1 foot away from a reservoir just upstream from town being overtopped and contributing even more floodwaters to an already ravaged town. Vermont didn't have the legal authority to even inspect dams. They couldn't go onto a dam owner's property without their permission until 2018. And since then, they've, like James said, supercharged their program. They went from only a few dam safety officials to now having 8 with plans for 12. In 2024, Vermont passed a $4 million dam safety revolving loan fund by the state legislature that is kind of similar to what I've heard described, planned for Maine, that kind of draws on those funds to make repairs to dams in the worst condition. They also have more state dam safety inspectors, engineers to go out and look at these dams and judge their condition and make recommendations, and are, I believe, working on more legislation or have passed legislation that can better compel dam owners to kind of move in that direction in terms of maintenance. We're going to start opening up for questions in a few minutes, I believe, but I was wondering if we could just kind of have a reflection period here. If there's anything that's kind of come up that we think is especially pertinent as we consider, the legislative session, although it moves quickly, there's always potential for new bills that can kind of address these issues. I'm curious what other aspects of maybe the abandonment statute or the dam safety program that is currently unresolved that you all have been thinking about that could strengthen it, maybe empower municipalities a little bit more who are directly impacted by these dams. Any thoughts? If anyone wants to interject, maybe we could start with our town officials.
The difficulty in this process, or one of the difficulties, there are many, is that while there's an abandonment statute that allows, if no new owner is found and the water is let out, that the ownership remains with the owner who but it sits there, and any subsequent, it's a piece of infrastructure which is going to deteriorate and eventually cause more issues. And since we're a taxing authority and these things are taxed, if they simply don't pay their taxes for 3 years, it becomes a foreclosure question, which the communities would have to deal with anyway. That it's certainly not what anyone wants to do, but in finding a solution, taking ownership, active ownership, and then in some form, in Bucksport, there's the Bucksport Generation and Maine Water are both major players here who have. The other thing that wasn't mentioned is the significant number of legal obligations that go along with these dams. When these dams were established, the owner created deeded rights to dozens, if not hundreds, of property owners to guarantee lake levels in these lakes in front of their properties. And also, there is guaranteed water rights to now Maine Water, originally was to the town, for a certain amount of water to be available for the public water supply. And there's contractual and legal obligations to Bucksport Generation for water for their industrial process. And the legal work to determine what happens with all of these contractual obligations hasn't been done by anyone. And our attorney estimates it would take someone a year to work through trying to figure out what those legal obligations are. And so as we look at potential ownership, that's a big glaring, that's not necessarily like many other dam situations, and what makes this even more challenging for the communities and the lake associations and the people who own properties with these deeds that guarantee them certain rights. So it's what felt complicated at the beginning continues to, you pull one string, you find three more, but I do think that we've been very fortunate in this process, that we have a bipartisan effort with the legislators in this region. Representative Bishop is also a town councilor for the town of Bucksport. Nina Milken has done yeoman's work in contacting officials, as has Mr. Bishop, and having that bipartisan nature of these bills and things, I think will help them make it through the legislature at a much faster speed than they would if we were picking sides here in terms of political affiliation. And that has not raised its ugly head in this thing. Everyone is sort of pulling in the same direction for a good solution to a problem that we didn't create or ask for, but are tasked with solving. So I guess that's.
Yeah, I would definitely say that once we've made it through whatever process we're going to make it through, I think we'd all be very willing to help rewrite that statute from top to bottom, because it is just cumbersome. It is just not working for those of us who are having to go through the process. So probably not this session, but I'd be happy to spend time rewriting.
Yeah, and as we've said, I mean, these dams are kind of the guinea pig. I've heard concerns that this could show other dam owners just the playbook on how to go through the abandonment process once the waters have been tested, and if they go through it, if DEP ultimately approves the forfeiture of the dams, and it's not as hairy as maybe other dam owners thought it might be, it could set up a precedent that others could follow, which is kind of exposing the loose language in the statute and kind of the bumpiness of the process that creates. So with that, I guess we'll open up to questions. If people want to raise their hand, and I think, Kate, would you mind bringing them the microphone? And we'll have our panel here to answer them to the best of our abilities.
We do have online questions, so if there are none in the audience, I can.
Okay, I think we'll start in person. Just requesting that you keep your question under a minute. If it is any longer, we'll jut in and kind of ask you to be a little more concise. So.
Turn off. Turn off.
I can hear you.
My question is that James, I think that's, my name is Jeff. I'm from Blue Hill, and I'm trying to sort out who has the inspection reports that have been done on the dams whenever they were last done, who owns those, and can they be made public?
So I don't know the specifics of this dam. I can speak in some general sense to that. Generally, what Maine does is reconnaissance of dams, not like a full-fledged formal inspection. They can catch some things during their inspection. I think those are generally available upon request to municipalities. It's not a full-fledged inspection. If these owners hired a professional engineer to do the inspection for them, I don't know if there's a mechanism to require them to share that information. In other states, that is part of the statute. It's something for Maine to consider, that if you're trying to sell or transfer a dam, you have to disclose all that information. But as far as anything the owner paid for, I'm not sure.
The MEMA did do cursory inspections in 2021, and we do have those reports. They're publicly available. So I think there are probably on most of the town websites. The owner has done more recent in-depth inspections with dive teams, et cetera, as recently as last spring. And those are the reports that we feel would be more valid to get that data, and we've asked for it.
I believe the most recent inspections by MEMA that were mentioned are under the kind of link package on the Department of Environmental Protection's website regarding the petition to forfeit these dams. So if you look at it's really kind of like a thorny web of links to get to, but you should be able to find it. I think going the town route might be easier in that regard though, but you'll be able to see the report I referenced from 2021 that found significant structural inadequacies with the Silver Lake Dam. And I am blanking on what and when the other dams had inspections filed, but I believe that information should be on DP or the town's website.
We used to have tabletop exercises involving officials from all of the affected communities to discuss the what ifs of a breach. I'm in my 10th year, and within the first 3 years, there were 2, and there have been 0 since. None.
Yeah. Maybe, James, that's something you can touch on, because Maine requires dam owners to keep their emergency action plans. Is that right? So these are what if plans. If a dam fails, the dam owner has a list of all nearby property owners. They should have that on file and contact information. They don't have to test that plan regularly. They just have to have it on file. I believe that's what MEMA requires. But maybe you could walk us through what an EAP looks like and kind of the significance of practicing them frequently.
Yeah, the emergency action plans are required by statute now in Maine for any significant or high hazard dam. Kind of lays out what would be impacted if the dams were to breach. So there's always an inundation map with it showing what bridges, what roads, what houses, what businesses will be impacted, what other dams will be impacted by that. There's normally some coordination with the emergency responders, so local municipal forces, sheriff, county emergency responders, state, whatever the situation may be in the particular community, to here's how we respond in emergency. Here's where we might be able to find supplies and construction equipment to help respond. Here's the roads we have to shut down. Practicing those is an incredible, valuable use of time. You never want to implement one of those emergency plans, but if an emergency should happen, it's great to have people that have practiced it. I think what you shared about not practicing those tabletop exercises is symptomatic of the state of the funding for the program. So those were pretty frequent. Maine has stepped in and done the emergency action plans on many of these dams for the owners themselves. But because they're short on staff and they haven't had a professional engineer since about 2021, I just don't think they have the resources they're struggling to keep their head above water with just the inspections. And I think the tabletop exercises are really difficult to fit into the current staffing situation there.
It created a cohesion in the region with emergency responders and public officials that extended beyond just, I mean, we all have mutual aid agreements and those kind of things, but like get together and work through this, provided a level of contact and cooperation that was, like a silly word, reassuring in terms of our ability to know who, what, when, where, and how more quickly than I think I would say I knew today.
Another question from the audience?
Yes, right over here. I can wait.
No, go ahead.
Yes, so it's a journalist, an engineer, 2 public servants. You represent the institutions and interests of a single species. And what I haven't heard tonight is any consideration of larger environmental issues and of the impacts of, it seems like an opportunity, the golden opportunity to discuss the potential impacts of removal or alteration of the dams on larger habitat within the watershed and the lives and habitats of species other than our own. So I guess my question is, are these environmental considerations being undertaken as part of this process? And who's leading the charge with respect to investigation of habitat potential changes to habitat before and after?
Great question. And just to reiterate it, we're asking what other conditions are being considered in terms of the broader environment, not just human impacts. If dams are removed or let loose, how would that impact habitat or fisheries or whatever might be living in the lakes? And just to answer off the top of my head, I mean, I think that would fall under the Department of Inland Fisheries and Wildlife review. If it ever gets to them, they would be, I mean, that's what the statute calls for. They have to do a full evaluation of what the impacts on fisheries and habitat would be if these dams are removed or opened and the water drained. As far as other considerations, I'm not sure the town committee have a bunch of experts working on things, so I'm not sure if that's one of the things they're considering.
We certainly have been thinking about that because we're very concerned with in that watershed in particular. There's a dam that's not even part of it, the Orland Village Dam, and then Alamoosook and Toddy, and the alewife run is really important to the area. Actually, Orland's one of the very few towns that actually has an actual alewife harvest still. So we're very cognizant of the environmental issues. One of the things that I think, more than I think, the lakes do provide a lot of habitat for loon nesting. That's a very important issue, as well as eagle habitat. So those are important considerations as well. Those of us that have been involved in this for a long time are very committed to doing everything we can to improve fish passage and make sure that if we are not going to take them out, well, first off, the statute is to drain the lakes. It does not take out the dams, which are very likely then to deteriorate, fall into rubble, block everything, and flood the world. So it's it's just a bad endpoint. If it had been written to take out the dams, that would have made more sense. But at this point, we're just going to have a bunch of rubble laying there that's going to block all the fish and everything else. Balancing with the economic impacts and the recreational impacts, those of us that are working on this are very committed to it, assuming we end up with the ownership, trying to build a coalition of environmental groups and people that have a lot of experience to seek grant funding to rehab these dams with the express purpose of trying to improve the fish passage so that we can, if we're going to have them, to make them the best they can be. There's a lot of talk about these natural rock riffle dams. And until you do an engineering analysis, you don't know if it'll work in those situations or not. But you've really got people involved in this whole thing that are very cognizant of it and trying to find a balance between the human and the ecological.
Another question from our in-person audience.
Can you hear me? I'm Lucy Leaf from Toddy Pond and have been following this for quite some time. My question has to do with the state agency review. And that's something that, while you mentioned it as part of the petition process, we're not hearing very much about that. There's, our lakes they're great ponds. And having been involved with writing the comprehensive plan for Surrey, there's lots of rules and laws about protecting the water quality in our great ponds, federal and state. If there's no water in the lake, you haven't met water quality standards. I mean, it's sort of obvious, but this just never comes up. Now the state, I think there's a lot of us that recognize, especially with Toddy and Alamoosook, are high value recreational. Toddy probably the most used, not only in Hancock County but region wide. We get, as I mentioned before, just a very big volume of boats on the lake, and also the landing is owned by DACF, Department of Ag, which is the second agency to review. And it would be very difficult for them to say there's no high value, there's no public interest here. Now, this doesn't come up because so many people say, oh, the state will never take it, or they don't have any money, et cetera, et cetera. Now, we know that the statute was sort of written in 1996, as you said, to kind of pit the state against local lake owners, that if you don't take care of this, then it goes to state review, or the lake could be drained. And so we all have this thing in mind that lake's going to be drained. So there's many of us who would like to get that state agency review before we have to, decide, is the entire responsibility always going to go to the locals, always going to go to lake owners, always going to go to the town, when there is so much general public that is benefiting from this, and how it contributes greatly to the economy of the state and vacation land and all that sort of thing. Do you have any thoughts at all? I mean, my thought is that the state would work with us, and that would be an ideal solution. But it seems to pit us more against the state than anything.
So the question is, what are the agencies doing to review dam ownership when they get to that consultation period? And
get to the question.
Yeah, what public value do they judge, and how does that compel them to take over ownership?
My understanding is that we have to do all the work first, decide nobody can own it, and then it goes to them.
Yeah.
I don't think we're ever going to get there.
Yeah. Well, I can touch on just what I've heard from officials, because when this petition was filed in July, I was trying to get to the bottom, because I read what everyone else did in that statute and saw that at some point the state agencies will review it. So I called I called the Department of Inland Fisheries and Wildlife and asked, okay, what would compel you to take over ownership? They've never done this before. They had very loose descriptions of what public value in their agency's terms would consist of, like we went over: recreation, fisheries, loon habitat. Those are things that they would consider. But what ultimately breaches that threshold to compel them to take over the dam in the interest of the public, I'm not sure. I don't think they're sure either. I don't really see how that would occur. And I know that's not a great answer, but it's just never been tested before. It's unprecedented. And I mean, it would require a big chunk of state money for any of those agencies to do that. And we've seen the budget constraints that Maine's currently in. I mean, I don't know how they would account for taking on infrastructure assets that have so many costs attached to them, liability issues, you name it. I mean, the towns are familiar with that. They're going through it right now. So it's just really a murky question, and there's no clear answer. There are just general descriptions of what each agency does and what they like and what they think is a public value, but no real connection that I've seen so far to what would actually compel them to take over dams.
It's not a matter of compelling. They must, if they determine that the public value is greater than the maintaining the so it's not a matter if they want to, or feel like it. They must. But I agree with you that it's a criteria that they really.
Yeah, no threshold I'm aware of. We'll take a couple more questions in person and then go online.
There's a lot.
Hi, Ron Russell from Rhode Island. I would add that part of the problem to that is that in the statute, they are weighing taking ownership of the dam against the cost of the dam. And for departments that are stretched thin of money, it's going to be hard for them to find it without legislation. It's sort of a fatal flaw in that particular statute. But my question, I guess, is for James. I'm fairly familiar with LD 1488, which is a resolve that came out of the first from the white paper that was done by Stephen Mallory about the state of the DSP program in Maine, and then followed by the peer review from ASDSO. In that resolve, which I think went to the forget which committee it went to.
Veterans, I believe.
Yeah, it seemed like an odd.
Yeah, that's what the dam safety program is. Yeah.
But there was a recommendation in there, which is the legislation that's pending. I think the Department FEMA is going to try to write that. Do you feel, if you're familiar with it, that those recommendations for a reinvigorated DSP program are adequate? And also, I wasn't quite sure if you work for the directly, and if you had input into that ESP reinvigorated program.
So just to reiterate the question, you're asking about Resolve, which was just submitting a peer review that was compiled by the National Association of State Dam Safety Officials. I always get that acronym mixed up. And they had a list of recommendations. And we're asking James if he thinks those recommendations would be helpful for the dam safety program, or maybe what else could be expanded on them. And I did a little reporting on that peer review. I've read over it a bunch of times. I mean, I think a lot of it comes down to funding and enforcement mechanisms, some things that we've already talked about. So I'll leave the rest to James.
Yep, thank you. I don't work for the dam safety department. We're a private consultant. We have no contracts with the state on their dams at this time or ever. I have reviewed the ASDSO program. That was actually the peer review. That was one of the successes. We felt that ASCE, after the 2020 report card, it took some time. COVID was in the middle of that, and there were some other priorities the legislature was addressing. Took a little bit of time, but getting that peer review, that legislation passed to get the peer review and get some recommendations, I think was a key outcome for us. We really liked seeing that there was forward progress on that. I think there's a lot of great recommendations in there. I think a lot of them are really consistent with that model dam safety program. That would be a real good target for Maine. I think realistically, it's going to be a multi-year, multi-step legislative process. Vermont went through a similar thing. They kind of have like phase one, getting started, phase two, and now they're kind of starting to expand the program. I think it's going to take several legislative sessions and kind of going through the prioritized, let's get the funding first to get the program to a point where it can run all these other enforcement compliance. They need a lot of help just to get to that point where they have additional capacity. But I think it's a good direction to go.
Just a quick add-on to that. In the Vermont program, there is a yearly fee to dam owners. Would you be in favor of that as part of the program? It seems almost that it's inevitable that.
I think the key for ASCE is a sustainable funding mechanism. There are states that choose, since it's one of the big benefits of the program is protecting the public, they funded it through the general fund. There are other programs, and especially the ones that provide more direct value that do the work for the owners. They have the fee that's more kind of like you can pay a consultant to do this work, or you can pay the state and the state will do it for you. So we've seen a lot of different mechanisms, and there's quite a bit of funding, match funding available at the federal level, that if the MEMA state program can build out, the federal government will match some of that funding and help expand the group further. So that was one of our key recommendations too, to get to that point where you can start matching and kind of like doubling every dollar that the state puts into the program. So there's a lot of mechanisms to fund that program that can be considered, and really it's going to come down to what the legislature chooses.
So we'll take one more brief question from the audience, and then we're going to switch to online. So if we could just keep it concise so we have time for as many questions as we can jam in these last few minutes.
At the heart of the problem, trying to get to the bottom of what's happening with the owners of our dams is the issue of lack of transparency. They will not disclose the conditions of their dams, releasing paperwork for knowing at any time what the condition of the dams are. When you buy a car, if you have a VIN number of a car, you can go online and you can find out what the condition of the car is. So when it's sold, there is transparency. It's open to the public. My question is there legislation, or maybe Ms. Milliken or somebody may be thinking about how to compel this issue such that it works the same way, so that dam reviews, engineering reports, and all that are filed such that there is a repository a database so that people through just public interest can look up and know what the condition of the dams are that are outside their neighborhoods and are potential hazards to their everything.
Sure. So the question is there legislation that would require dam owners to make their report or make reports of the conditions of their dam publicly available, or the inspections of dams by state dam safety officials? And if I remember correctly, I can't recall the language specifically of the bill that was introduced that would extend the town's consultation process for considering dam ownership. But I do believe there's language in that bill that would also kind of make it more strict on the information that a dam owner needs to supply to the DEP if they file a petition to forfeit their dam. That's kind of the murky area we're in right now. There's this state report, but there have been more private reports that are more in depth that have been conducted that haven't been made public to the towns or the state. I can't recall the language specifically, like I said, but I do believe there's a facet of that legislation that would, compel dam owners to share that. But I don't know if
And that would only apply to the abandonment process. I think what you're asking is generically, is there a legislation to get that data out in the public for all dams in the state?
Yes.
And right now, there is no pending legislation for that. It's just pertaining to the abandonment process.
I mean, I believe you can file like Freedom of Access Act requests these are state documents.
State ones you can get,
Yeah.
but it's other privately held information.
Yeah.
That's the problem. You can't get that.
Yeah.
Part of the discussion or part of this consultation process that is complicated by the fact that Bucksport Mill has indicated that it wants non-disclosure agreements with all 5 towns before meeting to discuss. And towns are public entities. There's only certain things that we can talk about in private, and it isn't something, in my estimation, that's as big an issue for our residents as the condition of these dams or the legal liabilities associated with them. So as we work through this process, part of this process will be working through legally what we have to do as an NDA and what we can say, no, we peace out. We're sharing this with everybody. We're not doing this behind closed doors and then coming up and saying, we know all the answers. We're not going to tell you anything, but trust us, we're the government. So, so that non-disclosure agreement process, which the Lake Association went through a similar issue in that they would have had to have gone through, where they couldn't talk to certain entities and
But they still weren't given the information.
No, they still didn't get the
signed
information, but that's another piece in this puzzle. As we work to get information, we need to be able to get it without saying we're going to get it and we can't tell anybody what it is. I mean, that is counterintuitive to the process, which is public information to make decisions. So.
I think we'll take questions from online now. Kate, I'm going to bring the microphone over to Mika, who will read some of them off.
Thank you. A lot of good questions online, so I'm going to try and pull some of them together. So a couple questions further on legislation, since we're on legislation. A couple of questions. One is about, has DEP weighed in on what it would recommend in terms of changes to existing policy and legislation? Is there, in the existing legislation, is there a clause about good faith, and could DEP or other departments compel dam owners to be more transparent under that good faith? So
interestingly enough, the answer is yes, DEP, the good faith effort is part of the statute. And yesterday, the DEP issued a letter to Bucksport Mill LLC indicating that it was aware that the 5 communities had been requesting information and not received it. And that as part of a consultation report has to be done by Bucksport Mill LLC at the end of the consultation period, outlining what has happened during that period. And the dam coordinator's letter indicated that report, when the department received it, would be put on the department's webpage for a 30-day public comment period, and they would consider any comment submitted in regard to that report by anyone who was currently part of the process or not, and that they would be considering the level of effort and cooperation that Bucksport Mill had exhibited as part of this. This is the first time in this process that we have had anything in writing that sort of defined what good faith effort meant. And so I personally was thrilled to get that letter.
As I was too.
And circling back to DEP's role in it, I mean, the bill that I referenced from Representative Milken is a department bill. As I understand, at the start of the legislative session, Representative Milken met with the DEP commissioner and a consortium of other legislators to look at this statute and figure out what can be done to strengthen it and to tighten the language. And that resulted in this initial bill with others to come. So,
but it also was a discussion that what is contained in that bill would pertain to this petition application, that it would be retroactive to this petition. No financial requirements were put in the bill because those were considered that you couldn't back that up. But information requirement, time limits, and all those kind of things, which are what are involved in it. The really positive part is that it would apply to this petition application that's already in process. So that is I won't say it, when that legislation passes, that will be very important to this process.
another question?
Yeah, so there's a question about, you guys talked about responsibility and liability, and a question here is, in the existing situation, if a storm came along and blew out the dam, would the owner be forced to rebuild? So what is the current responsibility of the owner? And then sort of an adjacent question to that is, in the proposed quasi-municipal entity, what would that entity's responsibility be vis-a-vis maintaining the dam, safety standards, et cetera?
Great. So the first question we'll take a stab at is how would a dam owner have to respond if their dam was breached or overtopped or blown out or in some way destroyed, and that resulted in some sort of significant flooding event? What kind of liability exists? James, are you familiar with kind of what happens when that disaster occurs? I mean, do dam owners really have any obligations to the state or the people whose lives or homes could be affected by that?
I think there's a whole sort of deed and language thing that you guys know much more than I do. I think in one sense, from a dam safety perspective, the safest dam is no dam. So at that point, the dam jurisdiction may stop. I don't think there's short of contract requirements. I don't think there's a state forcing somebody to have a dam that they don't want to rebuild.
Mm-hmm. And then on to the next question, which is about the quasi-municipal entity. What kind of I don't know, I guess part of it is like liability insurance. What kind of obligation or more so just obligations to maintaining the dam?
Obligations in general, what we're considering is that this organization would have would take ownership of it, would either levy fees or taxes to lakefront property owners in towns to fund it. It would be responsible for operations, maintenance, repairs. It would be able to apply for grants to do all the renovations and rehab that we want to do. So basically, they're the dam owners that could, in good faith, keep these dams in good condition and improve them. and do everything associated with that. There was another part to that question. Oh, the liability. Our assumption is that because it's a quasi-municipal organization, it can have the same liability relationship as towns due to infrastructure.
Thank you. And another question, if the lake is partially drained, who then would own the newly exposed land? Does it become public land? Is it private land?
I think it's still to be determined. We've gotten the preliminary idea that it belongs to the state, but I don't think anybody has a definitive answer. And it's substantial. We have maps that show that we expect both lakes would drop about 8 feet. And for the most part, that gives you a lot of properties then are 400 feet away from any water whatsoever. So there's very significant changes to the lakes if they drop that much.
Okay, and one more question about the pending legislation. Would that apply to other dams in the state that are being removed or partially breached?
It's not specific just to these three dams. It relates to the statute, improving the statute that was created in 1996.
And even this entity we're designing would not be specific. It could be adapted to other dams in other places. So it's not just written for these two.
Okay, and then one last question. There's a lot of you, so I'm trying to go through them all. Okay, are there any benefits to removing the dams? The questioner is thinking of the Edwards and Vesey dams that people didn't want removed, but actually benefited fisheries. This, I guess, is a little bit similar to the other question that was asked. Plus removing the need for dam insurance and inspection.
You take a swing.
I mean, sure, yeah, it's a complicated question.
So I'll try and be fair in this. We've been involved in a lot of situations, debating the two courses of action, other courses of action. There's a lot of benefits to dam removal. There's a lot of benefits to keeping the dams. What I would encourage is what I heard earlier. There's a community survey. It really needs to be a community-driven process. As an engineer, I can design anything as long as there's enough money to do it. But it's really the community that has to tell their leaders what's worth spending money on. So where we get that feedback as engineers to design a removal or design a repair or rehabilitation to really comes from the community. But there's environmental aspects, social aspects, tax values, economic, recreation, all sorts of things. And those are really difficult as an engineer to quantify, but they're really helpful for the community to contribute. So I just reinforce what we heard earlier. Check out the survey, please fill it out, share with your leaders what your community values are.
And just to add on to that, that is the first question that we're addressing. Should they stay or not? So we really do want to get people's thoughts and input on that. So we aren't going with the automatic assumption. I mean, most of us think they ought to stay. Some of us do, but we're asking. So if, the plurality of folks said, nope, just drain those lakes, don't care, then we would be sensitive to that.
I wouldn't be sensitive.
Well, because you've got
we have a public water supply that
they can't drink
that serves 700 people, and we have the sewer treatment plant that the town constructed in 2018 at a cost of $14.8 million that relies on having a public water supply associated, and we have $46 million in property valuation in one business in Bucksport that relies on that water for the cooling of the tower at Bucksport Generation. They're finding another water supply for the town, although that would be multiple times the cost of maintaining the dam. I mean, that portion is which, where Silver Lake isn't that we don't allow swimming, but we allow boating, and that has limited development in a great deal around the lake, along with the fact that town owns considerable land around that lake to protect the watershed. So the idea that Silver Lake Dam goes is I mean, short of a breach would be catastrophic with everything except life loss.
And one last question.
Yeah, the last question is, do we have a sense of what the ballpark costs to strengthen each of the 3 local dams in question are, and what are the estimated annual maintenance costs?
Well, don't we wish we knew? That's the information we're asking for, is what have been the costs? What is, how, what's the condition, so we know what kind of rehab we have to do. The only possible benchmark that we can throw out is we have, in this process, we've talked to a lot of other communities that are managing dams, and we've asked them about them. I mean, all dams are different, so they're not, they're apples and oranges, but the common amount seems to be about $10,000 a year in operation and maintenance costs. Who knows if that applies to ours, because we don't know the conditions, but that's at least a ballpark to think about until we get the real information. And then in order to strengthen them and improve them and fix the fish passages, we'll have to do engineering evaluations and studies. So that's just nearly impossible to answer.
I think we'll conclude with that. Thank you all so much for attending. I'll be hanging around if you want to come up and chat. Otherwise, thanks again. Hope everyone gets home safe. And thank you for spending this Tuesday night with us. Hope it was insightful.
Thank you.
Thanks for coming.